Welcome back. I'm Shelby, here with Shae.
I'm Shae.
We're going to continue talking about the 2 records that we made together.
No trust, no fear, no ambition.
So we've covered a little bit of how the first album was made. Let's get into the second, which happened very shortly after. In fact, I started writing the second album as soon as we finished recording the first one. And I let you know, and you said, all right, let's do this again.
Yeah, I think that was more your timeline push, to be honest. You were the one that kind of were like, all right, you want to do another?
No, you're right. And I think it's because I realized that there was sort of more that I had to say. There was sort of a continuation of the story. It wasn't a whole new concept. It was actually a continuation or an expansion of what we had worked on. So much so that it ended up being that the way we ended the first record was how I wanted to start the second.
Yeah, I'm curious about the writing process itself. Like, when did you actually have the second record put together?
We finished recording the overdubs for the first record like early fall of 2021.
Yeah.
Within a month of the last studio session, I had started writing Set to Self-Destruct, which was sort of the first new song for the second record.
Sometimes I wake up with one foot off the curb.
At the same time, I had a couple of songs kind of swirling around that I felt would make sense and that I still wanted to record that didn't necessarily fit the narrative of the first record, but I thought might work well in the second. So I would say pretty much immediately after we finished the first, I kind of knew some kind of continuation here. That's when I really started to think about the production sort of right away as I was writing in terms of what kind of sonic worlds was I going to build this time. And I really was feeling a little bit more ambitious, which an interesting tie-in to then the concept that I ended up building for the record, which was no ambition.
Only desire.
Only desire. Ending the record with a song that sounded very different from the rest of the album was a really interesting creative spark for me in writing the continuation of that and using some of those sounds that we had started to explore when we were in the studio. It just gave me so many more ideas of places I wanted to go in terms of trying new things and also working with Allison again. I think that having them in the studio was very inspiring and a source of a lot of creative progression for me in terms of seeing a musician with this particular style and way of playing. It really opened up some ideas for me in terms of leaving space in what I was writing for another performer to come in and contribute their unique process and style as well.
Yeah, I mean, straight out the gate, you even had more ideas for how to build these songs. Like last time we talked a lot about being like an open book and like a block of marble that you have to chisel away.
Yeah.
And this one was completely the opposite experience, where a lot of the ideas were actually right from the get-go, like wanting to incorporate Ali and what they bring and everything that they brought through the process was day one. Also expanding by bringing in Jay too was kind of a happy accident that a lot of the stuff that he brought worked really well with kind of the sonic world that Ali was so good at doing. Like, but these ideas for these creative sonic textures were like right out the get-go, where like last time we had a few things here and there, but a lot of it was built through the process.
It's true. Definitely my own sort of production notes going in were very detailed.
Yeah.
I had a lot more direction in terms of what kind of story I wanted to tell and how I wanted to tell it, because I had accessed all these new things and had become aware of all these things that we could do in the studio and with these other musicians, because we brought back a lot of the musicians from the first record. And then, like you mentioned, working with Jay, who's just as multi-talented. He has so many things that he was bringing to the table that we could play around with. That it made the process much more streamlined than the first record, which was very cool because we got to come into the studio and make the most of our time in terms of really getting to all these different sounds and try things. And it was the same in the sense that there's a lot of things that we did and it was like, oh, this might make it on, this might not. And, you know, there was a lot that went into selecting what was working best. With Oblivion, for example, it was a lot of just like recording a bunch of stuff and then sort of deciding what was fitting and what wasn't, and what was going to tell that story the most effectively. I can kind of pinpoint the moments where creative progression, skills progression is happening in these records, in these two records. And I think it's like what we did at the end of the first album with In the Next Life on Another Planet, where we started to let that sort of improvisational elements and more sort of atmospheric things to make something that sounded very otherworldly and dreamlike.
And maybe in another life on the next planet out of sight, we'll build something that cannot break and pretend it's our home.
That we then brought back and I think expanded on and improved upon in the second album with the opener. It was so fun to be able to tell a story, tell a continued story, but also progress and being able to give more specific direction to get this desired outcome. And I think that whole process is extremely rewarding. But I think you're right that then we get, you know, in the back half of this second album, I think is another progression that's happening in our process as collaborators. And for myself as even an arranger in a sense, is opening new avenues for maybe the next thing that we do, or just it was a different approach for my own style of recording. I recorded some things at home. I was a lot more of like a hands-on process, and I see that as sort of a sign of things to come, which is exciting. And I think it's so interesting that these things are documented in that way, but also take on a different meaning in the context of the album and are telling that story. But it's also, if you dive a little bit deeper into the layers, they're telling the story of the creation of the art as well, which is the whole thing is so exciting. It's just awesome for so many different reasons.
And like, I do like the idea and the decision of kind of picking up where we left off, essentially, like how you touched on that a little bit, and then building on that, right? So I guess, what is the next point?
Well, that's the question. I'm working on it right now, so I guess we'll see. It's interesting too to mention, and I sort of alluded to this in our first conversation about the first record, is that these two records together form a loop. And I didn't know that that was the case until I had finished writing the second record. The second record ends in a similar way that the first one begins. It was difficult to make the decision to do that because it can feel almost like leaning on something sort of repetitive or doing the same thing again. But I think it was important for me to be able to close this chapter in a sense the same way that we had started it, because it was almost a reminder to myself of why I made these two albums. And a lot of that was the things that I was thinking and feeling at this time of immense loss, and being able to revisit that with a song that is a new song. Overdose was something I wrote in that, that period after we had recorded the first album. to draw that parallel back with Hell, but Overdose is a lot more. I think that is also a progression on that form.
Falling asleep in the passenger seat, one of many different ways my body betrays me.
It's still that sort of live voice memo-esque kind of sound, but it's a progression in the sense that the way that I wrote it was more evocative and had more to do with imagery. It was supposed to evoke that feeling of when I would, go on drives with my dad. That's what I was trying to capture in the simplest form. This is only something I'm learning how to do as I'm spending more time making music and recording, is how do I capture a feeling in a song. Those two songs with Hell and with Overdose, it's very interesting to go as simple as we can to capture a feeling, because on the rest of these two albums, I think we go really deep into these sonic worlds.
Yeah.
And it's always been important for me to, at some point in the record, and I think it's interesting to start and end that way, to pull back and actually go back to...
Yeah. Picking and choosing your moments and when to and when not to. Yeah, that's very true.
With the second album coming in with a little bit more of that confidence, I think we were able to pull off things that I don't necessarily think I could have even imagined or conceived of the first time I came into the studio.
Yeah.
Again, expanding on those, even the personal relationships with the musicians who play on the record, having a more developed understanding of each other's work contributes a lot to being able to dive a little bit deeper into these sounds and communicating all these different ideas.
Well, the collaborative nature, I guess, that we really kind of explored a lot this record that we didn't do last time, and that added so much. And I think that's why a lot of the songs kind of have their own identity and maybe a trademark or like somebody else's touch that maybe we wouldn't come up with those ideas directly, which I think also elevated the entire production and just made a lot of the choices easier too, because instead of searching and hunting for them, it was trusting somebody else in their process and allowing them to just speak and then seeing what comes out of them essentially.
Totally.
And then guiding it through slightly to shape it and end up where we want it ultimately. But you're working from a creative stronghold essentially, as opposed to kind of last time was a lot more looking for things, right? Being well, let's put this through here and see what happens with this, maybe this, that, blah, blah. There's a lot less of that this record, I think. It was a lot more, Allie, do some Allie stuff and we'll see what happens. Or Jay, do some Jay stuff. See what happens.
Leaving space for people to kind of put their stamp on it and their approach. And I think the result is really interesting. I think those are the moments on the record that I go back to and I'm wow, we captured something really special because it's very in the moment. And I think you're right on that it was all about trust. On a personal level, this is an important development, is being able to trust other musicians with, I wrote this thing and I'm I think there's space in here for someone to elevate it, to bring it to another level, to contribute their version of the story in a way. And I think that makes the songs better. I think that's what I've discovered in this process is most meaningful to me, is that collaborative element, is making music with other people. And we did touch upon that a little bit when we talked about things that I was learning through the process of the first album, but I think that was really solidified in the second.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely expanded on it, at least.
When those strings come in Girl Genius, it's kind of surprising upon first listen of what is about to happen right now?
Please cut this out. Please cut this out,
Shelby,
later. Please.
The throat clearing.
Please.